Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I have 4 chilling stories that come from the very heart of the nursing profession. Working as a nurse means dealing with life, death, and everything in between. But sometimes, what we encounter goes beyond the realm of the living. From mysterious phone calls to eerie encounters with the spirits of loved ones, these true stories will leave you wondering just how close the spirit world is to our own. Let's dive in and explore the supernatural side of nursing. Story number 1. I worked in a small town. The hospital wasn't big, and I was a new nurse, fresh to that hospital. It was my first hospital job, and before that, I worked in a nursing home. I remember one night, around 11 p.m., my wife and kids were already in bed while I was still watching TV. The house phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was from the hospital where I worked. I answered the phone, and a guy named Jordan was on the line. He worked in the staffing office. His job was to call nurses when the hospital needed extra help. Jordan told me that there had been a 4-car accident on the highway. The people involved were injured, and they were being brought to our hospital. He said the hospital needed more nurses, and that they were willing to pay double time if I came in. As Jordan was speaking, he kept coughing. I told him I'd be there, got dressed, and went to tell my wife that the hospital needed me. I drove to the hospital, and when I arrived, the house supervisor, Nancy, said everything was fine. There hadn't been any patients from a car accident brought in. I told Nancy that Jordan from staffing had called me. Nancy looked shocked. She told me that the person working in the staffing office that night was Anna, not Jordan. I thought that was strange, so I drove back home. When I got home, I noticed that our home phone was flashing yellow. We had one of those phones that flashes when there's a voicemail. I checked the voicemail, and there was a message from Nancy. In the message, she said they really needed me to come back to the hospital. I called the hospital and spoke to Nancy, and she confirmed that there had just been a car accident on the highway. 9 patients had been admitted, and they needed more nurses. I drove back to the hospital, and when I arrived, Nancy told me something shocking. 4 years ago, there had been a guy named Jordan who worked in the staffing office at night. But Jordan had been a long-time smoker, and he had died of lung cancer a while back. That was one of the strangest events I've ever encountered. Even Nancy looked surprised when I told her that Jordan had called me. Sometimes I wonder if things happen in the spirit world before they happen in ours. But in all of my 12 years of nursing, that was the strangest paranormal encounter I've ever experienced. Story number 2. I'm a traveling nurse, and since I'm single, I often take assignments far away from home. I remember taking a 3-month contract at a hospital where I was earning $107 an hour. I can't disclose which hospital it was, but it's in the northern part of California. It was a big city, and the hospital was right across the street from a cemetery. Many traveling nurses preferred to rent places near the hospital to make things easier, since they weren't familiar with the city. I was one of those nurses who rented a house nearby, which meant living close to the cemetery. The house had alarms on all the doors and windows, and any time one of them opened, I'd get a notification on my phone. I didn't rent the house alone. I shared it with 2 other nurses so we could split the bills. The only thing was, those 2 nurses worked the night shift, from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., while I worked the day shift. So at night, I was alone in the house. But before we moved in, the owner assured us that no one had ever died in the house. I didn't mind sleeping there by myself at night. It was a 3-bedroom house, and I had my own room. I worked in the cancer unit. I remember it was my 2nd week on the job. That morning, when I arrived at the hospital, there was a cancer patient who was expected to pass away overnight, but she didn't. My shift started at 7 a.m., and she didn't pass away until 8 a.m. That same day, I had another patient who had a line inserted into his neck for medication. This patient kept getting out of bed to pray, despite me repeatedly telling him not to, due to his high risk for fall. At one point, he got out of bed while the line was still connected to the machine administering his medicine. When he stood up, the line was yanked out of his neck. Blood started pouring from his neck down his right arm. He walked to the nurse's station and said, "Nurse, I don't know why, but I'm bleeding from somewhere." This patient had very low platelet counts, so once the bleeding started, it wouldn't stop. We sat him down in a chair, and one of us applied pressure to the bleeding site. However, he had lost so much blood that he fainted soon after sitting down. Despite our best efforts, including administering multiple blood transfusions, he passed away that day. That night when I returned home, my roommates had gone to work, so I was alone in the house. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was with me. Even after I got home, I felt like I wasn't alone. It was as if my soul sensed a presence nearby, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was because 2 of my patients had died that day. I went to bed, and around 4 a.m., my girlfriend texted me, waking me up. I checked my phone, responded, and then stretched, lifting my legs off the bed. When I dropped my legs back onto the bed, my right foot landed on something cold, something that felt like a hand. I froze. I didn't move my foot because I wanted to make sure I was really feeling what I thought I was feeling, and it was a hand. I stayed frozen for about 10 minutes, too scared to move. I could feel the hand slowly pulling itself away from under my foot. I pretended to be asleep while the hand moved. Once it had fully withdrawn, I looked down to the foot of my bed but didn't see anyone. I thought someone might have come into the house, but when I checked my phone, all the doors and windows were still closed. If anyone had opened a door or window, the security system would have alerted me. I sat up, turned on the light, and looked around the room, but no one was there. I was so spooked that I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I got up at 6:30 a.m. to get ready for work. When I put on my socks, I noticed there was dried blood on the heel of my right foot. I wiped it off and checked for any cuts, cracks, or wounds, but there were none. That's when I knew I hadn't been dreaming. Something really had come into my room that night. It's something that can't be explained. I still don't know if it was because we live so close to the cemetery, or if one of my expired patients had followed me home that night. As a nurse and an outdoor enthusiast, I love spending time fishing and hiking. These activities help me relax and recharge. Because I'm passionate about both the outdoors and my profession, I highly recommend the first aid kit linked in the description box. It contains 132 essential trauma and medical items that could be life-saving in an emergency. This is one of those items you'll always want to have with you, but hope you never have to use. Check out the link in the description to get yours. Stay safe and thank you. Story number 3. I live in Eureka, and I have a nice big yard. I had a black husky with blue eyes named George. He was an old dog, about 12 years old. I rescued him from the animal shelter when he was 4. He had been with me and my family for a long time. At that time, my father loved to raise chicken with his friends, so he appreciated that George was a big dog who could guard the chickens. Dogs are a lot like us humans. They can get the same diseases we do, like cancer, heart disease, strokes, diabetes, and more. George was an old dog by then. I work in a nursing home with many elderly residents who have dementia. They are very forgetful and sometimes say things that don't make sense. I remember one morning, while I was at work, my family called me. My sister told me that George couldn't get up. He was only blinking but wouldn't move his body. I told them to take George to the animal hospital. That day, when I got home around 4 p.m., my sister and George were already back. but George was still lying in his doggy bed in the dining room. My sister told me that the vet said George had suffered a stroke and would no longer be able to move his body. The vet recommended putting him down to end his suffering. At 6 p.m., I took George back to the animal hospital and requested that they put him to sleep. I held his paw until he peacefully closed his eyes and passed away. I was devastated and cried a lot. Some nights, I would wake up, open the window, and tell George to stop barking, only to realize that I must have been dreaming because George had passed, and I missed him so much. 2 weeks later, while I was at work, I was passing out medication to my patients. One of them, who had severe dementia, asked me the name of the dog that was following me around. I asked her, "What dog?" She said, "Oh, don't be silly. The dog's been following you all morning, room to room." I asked her to describe the dog, and she said it was a black husky with blue eyes. I was shocked. I told her that the dog's name was George. Sometimes, I wonder how people who are losing their memories can see things that we, with sound minds, cannot. Maybe it was just a hallucination or a coincidence. But knowing that George was still around after his death brought warmth to my heart and helped me through my grief. Our bodies don't last forever, but in the spirit world, George was able to move and run again. That brought me closure. In the end, I'm just happy that I was able to save a dog from an animal shelter and give him a good life. My parents never liked dogs, but they grew to love George. Story number 4. When I was a new nurse at a nursing home, I had a patient named Lula. Lula was very nice and sweet. She was 91 years old. Even at her age, she was always walking around and doing her own thing, never really bothering anyone. I used to work the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I remember one night Lula called me into her room. I went to see what she needed, and she told me, "Bobby was here earlier and told me to pack up. He'll be back to pick me up." I asked her, "Who's Bobby?" But she didn't answer me. She seemed confused, and when I checked her, I noticed she had a low-grade fever. I told her to go to bed because she wasn't feeling well. I tried to give her Tylenol to bring down her fever, but she didn't want it. I helped her into bed and told her to rest, then turned off the light. Lula had been taking antibiotics that week because she had a UTI. For those who don't know, a UTI can make elderly people very confused. At around 1 a.m., I heard my CNA screaming for help. I looked over and saw the CNA trying to stop Lula from leaving. Lula had a bag of clothes in her hand and was trying to walk out the door. She wasn't her usual sweet self. She was being aggressive, trying to scratch and bite us as we attempted to stop her. I quickly prepared a shot of Haldol and gave it to her in the buttocks. We sat her down in a chair and restrained her so she wouldn't hurt herself. As the Haldol started to take effect and she began dozing off, my CNA and I helped her back into bed. At the nurse's station, I told my CNA that Lula had mentioned someone named Bobby. I didn't know who Bobby was. My CNA told me that Bobby was Lula's late husband. They used to live at the nursing home together about 4 years ago, but Bobby had passed away from pneumonia. At around 3 a.m., Lula woke up and began calling out, "Bobby, Bobby, are you here? I can hear you, but I don't see you anywhere." I went into her room and gently told her, "It's only 3 a.m., Lula. You should go back to sleep." Lula then said, "Bobby will be back at 5 a.m. You need to wake me up." To calm her down, I replied, "Okay, when Bobby comes back at 5 a.m., I'll wake you up." I said that just to get her to rest, and it worked. She went back to sleep. At 6 a.m., the phlebotomist came in to draw Lula's blood. She was on a blood thinner called Coumadin, so her lab work needed to be done every other day. The phlebotomist went into Lula's room, turned on the light, and then quickly returned to the nurse's station. She told me she thought Lula had passed away in her sleep. I went into the room to check, and sure enough, Lula had already grown cold. She was gone. In the nursing field, situations like this happen often. Sometimes elderly patients become confused and forgetful. But one thing I've learned is that, death is near when they start talking about seeing deceased family members. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.